So based on these principles, what you might need to do is make sure that in your marketing for your intervention or in your intervention itself, you find out what the perceived benefits and barriers are that individuals are facing and address them, and that you also pay attention to who the individuals that you hope to reach look up to and who they're most likely to emulate, and get those individuals on board. So even if you convince an individual to use your product or engage in a behavior, if that product or behavior goes totally against what their friends and their family or people that they trust are doing, they're probably still not going to use that product or engage in that behavior. Now, one thing that's really interesting about diffusion is that the population can be divided into 5 different categories, and we call these adopter categories. So in any population, there are people who are called the innovators. This is a very small proportion of the population. These are the people that are always the first to try something new. They're the first people that are sleeping on the street waiting to get an iPhone. They're the first people to have a Fitbit. They're the innovators. Next, we have the early adopters. So these are not the first people to try a new trend, but they're pretty close. And it's actually these people who are the trendsetters because there's more of them. So once we have the innovators that kind of start this chain reaction, then they build a larger following through the early adopters. And typically, once the innovators and the early adopters have accepted a new product, this is when we start to see it sweep wider through the population and reach the early majority. So this is the 34% of the population who are not the first to try something, but they are not the last to try something either. Once we have gotten the innovators, the early adopters, and the early majority, we have achieved what is called critical mass. So we have at least half the population using the new product, and so chances are the remainder of the population is going to follow suit soon. Next, we have the late majority, so the 34% of the population that waits till most everybody else is doing something to try it. And then finally, we have the late adopters, so the last people to try something new. Then the diffusion of innovation specifies that characteristics of the setting in which the innovation is being disseminated is important too. So there's geographic factors. How close do people live together? Is it an urban? Is it a rural setting? Cultural beliefs and political conditions are all factors that could affect an innovation's adoption and spread. I want you to take a moment and pause and just think through why and how might each of these characteristics affect diffusion. Now let's talk about how we might think about the DOI in terms of its application in a health context. There's really 2 different perspectives. One, we can use the DOI to examine the spread of health behaviors at a population level, which is called a passive diffusion, or we can examine the uptake of new interventions. When using this first approach, examining the spread of health behaviors, one thing that's interesting is that the spread of health behaviors can usually be mapped onto the S-curve of the different categories of adopters. So this figure shows the S-curve next to a real graph showing the prevalence of substance use within youths. You'll see that it starts out with a small percentage of the population and then slowly gains critical mass, and then actually eventually declines, because typically we know that with substances and a lot of health behaviors, one behavior after it achieves critical mass and population is replaced by another. So let's think about what this means in terms of intervening at the individual level. What are the implications of the DOI for your research at the individual level? How and when would this be helpful in behavior change interventions, and what are the limitations? pause for a few minutes and think through the answers to these questions with respect to your research. What does this S-curve mean? What might the characteristics of individuals in the adoption categories mean for how you approach an intervention in your health area of interest? Well, one answer might be figuring out who to target. Maybe if you can identify who the trend setters are in a population, you can recruit them for your intervention and hope that if you get buy-in from them in your intervention, then the intervention or the behavior that you're trying to disseminate spreads throughout the population. Let's talk about the second approach to applications of the DOI, which is examining the uptake of interventions. According to the model, in order for diffusion to occur, you must find the appropriate fit between the innovation, the people, and the setting. But the question is, how do you do this at the organizational level? When you're trying to change the way an organization such as a school or a healthcare setting functions, how do you do that?